Well, hello Townsend, welcome back to our community Bible studies. Today we're in John 19, so dig out that Bible or just pop John 19 into Google if you haven't got a Bible. Tonight we're thinking about power struggles, and these are real, aren't they? Abuses of power are everywhere. We've seen it in our government, government versus the people, rich versus poor, husbands versus wives, parents versus children, white versus black, bosses versus employees. Wherever you find power, you find a battle or a struggle. It's not always the case. Some authority is good authority. But there's also the bad that goes along with that, isn't there? Bad power exists. And it's likely that you may not really understand that until you've been in a power battle, until you've been on the underside, trapped, abused, held back, held down by somebody or a system that is abusing its power. Abusive relationships, real modern slavery, county lines gangs, abusive parents, abusive church leaders, universal credit trapping people into a system, into a way of life. These are real in our world right now, aren't they? And they're wrong. And we have to face up to them. And as Christians, we know we must do something. During the whole Black Lives Matter debates and riots and right raising of these real issues, as Christians, many of us have felt a real desire to stand and support, to do something. But what do we do? How do we do it? What can we say? The problem seems too big for us to manage, doesn't it? And there are so many opinions in the world right now about what to do. I've struggled with that. How do we deal with this? How do we help? Especially when we're not in the ones that are being trapped or being pushed down or being abused. How do we speak into that? Now, I'm not here to give you my opinion. What I want to do is look at this passage in John 19 and see how that speaks into it. Because I think it shows us one of the most significant power battles in history. It's the battle between Pilate, the Roman governor, Jesus, and the Jewish leaders. All three of them have power, and they choose to use it differently. Let's have a look at the passage, John 19, first 16 verses. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize that I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. But the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you're no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, "Take him away, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So here, this power battle kicks off, doesn't it, with Pilate having Jesus flogged, whipped and beaten. Pilate's the one here with the most worldly power, isn't he, in this battle? He's high up in the most powerful empire in the world. He's got soldiers at the click of his fingers. And he uses that power here to try and take away all of Jesus' pride, all of the human power that he seems to have. They beat him, mock him, make him feel small, and then forcing a crown of thorns, big thick thorns, into his head and putting a purple robe on him. Purple was a royal colour, so they were mocking him by saying, look, in this beaten state, have your kingly clothes. And then he takes him back out and he parades him in front of the Jews. And he says to the Jews, like a pantomime horse, here's your man, the man you were so worried about. Are you worried now? There's nothing to be scared of. Look at him. He's not a king. We've made a mockery of him. And the Jews here show just how deeply ingrained their fear of Jesus is. And systematic issues often come out with fear, don't they? Everything Jesus has been doing and saying has scared the Jews. So even when presented like this, as a pantomime horse, they still shout, crucify him, crucify me, he has to die. And then they get to the number bit, we see what they're really annoyed about. They're saying, this man has to die because he's pretending to be God. He's blaspheming. As these Jewish leaders have heard Jesus teaching and seen what he's been doing, they've heard him claim to be a divine power, claim to be the God they worship, sent from above to lead them. He claimed to be the Messiah, the Christ that God promised to send. So he's not killed for being some freedom fighter or just being a good teacher here. He's being killed for being God. And that seems to scare Pilate, this man with so much worldly power. Verse 8 says he gets more afraid. So he's more afraid. He was already afraid of Jesus. There's something about Jesus that unnerves him. But hearing that he claims to be the Son of God gets Jesus even more afraid. He takes him back into his back room. And it turns out that beating and mocking is just a sham cover of his fear. Often that's the case in relationships, in homes, in workplaces where there's abuse. It's a cover for fear. The reaction of anger and abuse and pushing other people down can come out of our weakness, the fear of our weakness being shown to others. So people abuse to feel like they have that power still. Maybe that's been true of you in your life, either on the side of being the abuser or the abused. Pilate is realizing here just who Jesus might be. And he's afraid of doing the wrong thing. Am I about to kill God? So he says, who are you, Jesus? Where are you from? And Jesus sits silently. Incredible. At this moment, I think I'd be shouting for everyone to hear. Jesus sits silently. Pilate doesn't like that, does he? So he brings his authority back in. Don't you know who I am? Are you going to stay silent in front of me? Don't you know what power I've got? I'm the one that can save you here. I'm the one that can have you killed. And then Jesus breaks his silence and puts Pilate in his place, doesn't he? You see that verse 10? Or verse 11, sorry. You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Pilate, all the power you've got, any authority you've got over me has been given to you by God. The God I'm claiming to be. That power has come from heaven. God is in control of all things. We've seen that all the way through. God hasn't lost the plot here. God is still in control. Pilate, he is even in control over you. And that means for us, all the authority structures in our country, in our world, even the broken ones, are put there by God. And Jesus points us here to the God with ultimate power, the ultimate perfect authority. And as he does that, he stands up to this broken, abusive power. He says, your power is from God, but there is sin here. This whole situation is wrong. Those who gave me to you, Pilate, their greatest sin is in them. Notice he doesn't absolve Pilate of all his sin. He says the greatest sin is in the Jews. And we see that come in the next section. As Pilate tries again to free Jesus, it may be that he's too scared to kill him. But it turns out he's actually a bit of a snowflake, and he just wants to keep the Jews on his side. The Jews threaten to get his boss, Caesar, against him, and he buckles. And as the Jews do that, they show what Jesus was saying, the sin being in them, and it shows who they really worship, where their real authority is. They say, Jesus isn't our king, Caesar is. They're not really following God. Their religion is a cover-up for them wanting to grow their power. So they do that, even willingly, to get rid of God. They go against their God to get what they want. Bad, abusive power takes from others to protect themselves and get what they want. That's what the Jews do here. They want Jesus dead. So they'll go to whatever lengths it takes to make that happen. For in other situations, it might be taking of people's freedom. It might be physical, mental, sexual, financial abuse. It could be robbing people's peace or their health or their joy. Abusive power takes from others to get what it wants. But Jesus here points us to a God with a perfect good authority. He shows us that good authority by giving himself for us. He is steps away, moments away from the cross. And he gives of his own life, so that all those trapped in the abusive power of sin can be freed from it. Influence and authority, good power, gives of itself so others can live, so others can thrive, so others can grow. Jesus gives of himself here for us, for you and for me, so we can be free from the sin that takes what we want and feeds it at the expense of others. Sin makes us live in fear as well, doesn't it? And Jesus offers us freedom from that fear. And because we trust in Jesus, as John continually calls us to do, believe in him. That involves admitting that we're sinners, that we don't have that authority, that we've messed up with the influence and power we've got over ourselves and over other people. And we put that on Jesus. That's what believing Jesus is. He gives himself so that we can live under God's perfect power structure with real freedom. And as we do that, as we give ourselves to Jesus and live under his perfect rule, part of his kingdom, we must then respond by doing what's right. So we then fight for justice in our homes. We give of ourselves for our other halves, for our families, for our friends. We fight for the weakest in society, the people who can't speak up for themselves. We speak up about sin in the systems, in our country, in our town. But we do that in humble, self-giving ways. Because Jesus gave himself for us, we must give ourselves for other people. We must give ourselves for the weakest in society. That's what God has asked of his people all the way through the Old Testament, all the way through the New Testament. Protect the weak, stand up for justice. Those who are being abused, those who have power structures leaning down on them, whether that's individuals or whole systems. We must stand up for them because God is a God of justice. We don't turn away from our God to get what we want, but we follow Jesus as he gives himself and we give ourselves. Now, where do you start? The best place to start is in yourself. We must demonstrate this, dig out the pride and fight the ways that your sin is abusing others. It might be small ways, it might be big ways. There is grace for every abuser in Christ. And that is hard for us to take. But we must see the sin in ourselves before we fight the sin in others. We never think our sin in us is as serious as the sin in other people. You have influence over other people. And sin means that we have been using that badly. So go to Jesus, ask him for forgiveness. Take it to him. We don't need to stay in that state. Jesus offers us freedom. And that freedom is going to have different implications for different people, depending on how your sin has been working out in your life. But take that to the cross. Start afresh with Jesus. And then work out forgiveness, work out justice in your relationships, in your workplace, on your estate. Fight for the weakest in the places God has put you. For many of us, that means in Townsend. We need to fight for the weakest, for the children, for the abused, for the poor, because Jesus has fought and died for us. So we need to give ourselves. What's that going to look like for you?